Hi there. This is going to be a lecture on restoration literature as well as Orinoco. So, the War of the Three Kingdoms, or the English Civil War, or this period that is also called the Interregnum, is over and the monarchy is back. Charles II comes back to England from Europe in 1660. This is the restoration. It's the restoration of the monarchy. Puritanism officially goes out of fashion in government and culture. And the literature of the time, especially what we know as Restoration comedy drama, is known for its bawdiness, although not so much Orinoco, which is a novel, an early kind of proto novel. Though the Rochester and Ben poems we will have for next week will be quite explicit. And this is a picture of King Charles II. He is the son of the King Charles that is executed earlier in the century. Okay, basic timeline 1660, the monarchy is restored. The theaters are reopened, and now they have roofs, which is very exciting. They're not like the Globe. And we have female actresses. So this is many of whom are the mistress of King, will be the mistress of King Charles II. Charles II will found the Royal Society, which is very important. And this picture of Charles II shows him with all of his like little scientific instruments and globes and things. And the Royal Society is dedicated to increasing human knowledge through science. And it's very important for advancing science in England at this time. 1665 through 1666 will be a plague year where we have the return of the plague. And it's really important for London. Basically, 20% of the population of London will die in the plague. And that's about 100,000 people at this time. This has a big impact on culture, obviously. 1666, also we have the Great Fire of London, which destroys a significant portion of the city. So it's really a terrible year where a lot of people died and horrible things happened. But in 1685, Charles dies, and he died without an heir. He didn't have a male heir. His brother, James II, becomes king. And this is a problem because James II is Catholic. And he was reestablishing Catholicism. The people really did not like that. And so in 1688, we have what is called the Glorious Revolution, which is James II is deposed, but he's not executed. Instead, his daughter, Mary, is Protestant. And Mary and her husband, William of Orange, so this is William and Mary, this is where the name of the college comes from. They are Protestant. They become king and queen. And James is deposed, but he's not executed and there's no war. And that's why it's called the Glorious Revolution. That Britain is able to change its government and its leader without having a bloody war, which was seen as, something that's really important. And in this change, there were more limits that were placed on the king or the queen, because Mary is actually the queen. And we have more of a constitutional monarchy, which is very important. Okay, there are also important cultural changes. We have new goods or goods that were made much more available to people through colonialism and increased trade, notably tea, coffee, and chocolate. We have coffee houses. Coffee houses are going to be a really important part of culture for basically the next 100 years. They were places, it was a very male space, unlike what we might think about coffee houses today. Women were not really allowed in coffee houses, and certainly not encouraged to be there. Men would go there to like drink coffee and read newspapers and debate the events of the day. Um, it was an important place where like culture and politics and society was discussed and debated. Now, women were not part of coffee house culture, but women are increasingly playing a part in public life. Like we have female actresses. We will have female published authors. We will have more women writing and being public with their writing and making a living from writing. I said people were reading newspapers in coffee houses. We have newspapers. Newspapers develop and become really popular and are a way for people to get the news. So we have newspapers are very important. The Royal Exchange. Now, the Royal Exchange had existed before, but in the Great Fire of London, it burned down. And then they rebuilt it. And this is a picture of what it looked like when they rebuilt it. It was a place where merchants would come and sell their goods. That's the exchange, right? You're exchanging goods for money. And where you could go get like all these goods that were coming in off the ships from Britain's, trade and things like that. Shopping, increased consumer goods, and just this idea of being able to go shopping, and that was something that you might do. Continued imperialism and colonialism during this time, and increased participation in the slave trade. Up until this time, Spain had really dominated the slave trade, but England will start to kind of compete with Spain for doing that. And by the end of this century, like by the 1700s, and certainly into the start of the next century, England will come to dominate the slave trade. And cities in England will be important parts where the triangle trade of slaves and sugar and rum, right, will be very important. Characteristics of Restoration literature. It depicts vices more than virtues, especially those of an amoral court. Charles II's court was known for being a really good time. He had a lot of mistresses. There was a lot of drinking and gambling, and he had this group of male courtiers that were called the Merry Gang, that were basically unbelievably rowdy and rambunctious and vandalism, like all kinds of things. But okay, depicts vices more than virtues. Rejection of Puritanism. Before he was restored to Great Britain, Charles lived in Europe and he lived in France. And so there's a lot of French influence in his court. In the literature itself, we see a comedy of manners. And comedy of manners is where the humor depends on understanding how people are fitting in or not fitting in to social expectations about them. We see a lot of satire, a lot of social satire, a lot of political satire as well. People are feeling more free to criticize society and the political systems, and a lot of wit, witty wordplay, a more kind of like elegant focus on language. Aphra Behn, who writes Orinoco that we are reading. She is a staunch royalist. She works as a spy for Charles II. In addition to being a spy, she writes for money. She writes plays, she writes poetry, she writes novellas like Oronoku that we're reading. She is very successful, and she reflects on her role as a female author, and she is, if not the very first one, of the very first of the most successful women to make a living by writing. Um, and she goes to Suriname in 1663. And that's where Oronoku is going to be set. So here is kind of where Suriname is, and sometimes it has an E and sometimes it doesn't, in Africa. It starts out as a British colony. Fairly quickly, though, not when she's there, not when she's writing about it, it will become a Dutch colony, specializing in crops like tobacco and sugar. Notice how Ben characterizes the relationship of the indigenous people to the British colonizers. In American history, we often focus on tobacco as the big slave-produced crop, but in Europe, sugar was very important, very exciting, and new, and in some ways more associated with being produced by slaves than tobacco is. And Ben's take on slavery and the plantation economy that it supports is going to be pretty ambivalent. Her novel reflects a society that is still trying to figure out how it feels about colonies and slavery. She is very excited about the exotic landscape of Suriname. She does critique slavery, basically how it oppresses the great man Oronoku, who is born to be a king. But in other places, she seems to think that slavery is okay. It's more like slavery is wrong for Oronoku, but it's not necessarily wrong in and of itself. This is one of the very first novels. And when we talk about what is a novel, it's any longer work of prose fiction. Also, we had talked about romance with Breton Lays and Gawain and the Green Knight, right? And romances will also be used to refer to novels, and there'll be novels with fantastic elements, unrealistic, not realistic at all. But we also will have realistic novels. And out of romance will come Gothic in the Enlightenment will come Gothic novels, which have dark supernatural themes. I'm sorry, I'm recording this in Chicago, and they're sirens just going down the street. And there's also heroic romance, and this is really seeing the descendant of things like Gawain and the Green Knight, right? With brave heroes and beautiful heroines. With novels, we might think about characterization. Static characters are characters that don't change. Dynamic characters are characters that evolve and maybe go on an emotional or intellectual journey. Flat characters we might think of them almost as stereotypes, or we might talk about them as cardboard characters. They're defined by just basically one main trait. Round characters have lots of traits and often seem more realistic as a result. So as you read Oronoku, the novel, think about our protagonists, who are Oronoku and Imawinda. Are they static or dynamic? Are they flat or round? And how does characterization allow heroic romance to promote cultural values? Also think about, what do we make of the relationship between the colonizers and the indigenous people in Suriname? What should we make of the terrible king? Is Ben blaming the original cultures of enslaved people for facilitating slavery? What does Oronoku, the character, have in common with the white slaveholders? What makes him different from them? And think very carefully about tone in Ben's discussion. What words show us how she feels about what she is narrating? Also, think about why she uses heroic romance in order to write a novel about slavery. We could think about how Oronoku fits into the mold of hero. How does he compare to Beowulf or Gawain and the Green Knight? Um, how does this genre and the novel affect our sense of her position on slavery? And what do we think about her position on colonialism? These are all important questions to think about as you read Oronuko. I'll see you in class.